Okay.
Welcome, friends, for round, I forget.
Me too.
5?
6 or 7? I don't know.
6?
The first one,
Wait,
I wasn't even here until like 82 minutes after 7 a.m. Eastern time. So.
Wow. So now we're going to investigate, why is there property?
So there's agriculture, and you have to be able to fence off agriculture to keep animals from coming in and eating it. Sort of like a original selfishness to, well, it's not necessarily selfishness. You gotta, like insects, you can't necessarily control, although we figured out ways to do that, but we wind up poisoning ourselves in the process. Or weeds, that's been more of a problem because we learned to stop using DDT because it was actually changing our hormonal balances. Frogs were turning more into females, and the people also eating the food were losing some of their male traits and turning more, because the DDT would break down into a system that was like an artificial estrogen. The thing about cordoning off land to keep animals away was so that you could harvest these crops, but it is the difference between peoples who would nomad from area to area, and early agriculture, it said, is that they'd find things that they'd like to eat and they'd plant them there, and they'd come back a year later and there'd be more of those things, and then they'd shift from areas to areas. That must have been a very rich and full life, because you got to be constantly changing and seeing different lands. You got to experience different seasonal fruits of the lands, and you also would be carrying around these animals that were also found that would eat plants and that were found to be tasty and good for food. This was the world that we kind of came across. And then people, it's been argued that I think by a French philosopher whose name escapes me at the moment, Rousseau, I think, said, he had a famous quote about the first man who set up markers to make land claims or created ditches and said, "This is mine," that they were the founder of civilization, and that you should pull out the markers, and that you should fill in the ditches, and that you should say to everyone around you, "Don't believe this man. This is for this will lead to death and to murder." Because when you do that, then it leads to this claim of your claim to property is more important than other people's claims to life or to exist on the property that you're fencing off for yourself.
What did Rousseau say?
Let me get the exact quotes. Let me get the exact quotes.
You were breaking off or freezing, so we missed some key phrases.
So, do not believe.
And I heard that somebody put a ditch around a piece of land and said, "This is mine," and so that's the first property. Maybe.
Well,
maybe it was Abel or Cain. It was Abel's the one that was agricultural, so he needed property.
Rousseau's a lot closer to us than the invention of agriculture or specific territorial claims.
Head south on Ridgewood Avenue toward
very much valid. Let me see.
Continue for 1 mile.
Let me different quotes.
And what about people that live on an island? Then they have to fend off from others coming into their island.
So the quote from Jean-Jacques Rousseau was, "The first man," this is an English translation because he of course would have been writing in French, I think, but who knows, maybe he knew English too. The first man to fence in a piece of land saying, "This is mine," and who found people simple enough to believe him was the real founder of civil society. But then there's a longer
So
version of that quote.
ableized civilization.
Well, no,
Cain
Abe,
was
yeah,
more wild.
well,
maybe.
well, Cain, it basically came down to jealousy and pride, because Cain was proud of being able to agriculturally produce
Oh,
these. And
that's right. I got them
you could,
backwards.
yeah, you could read these as literal stories, or you can read them as allegories to agriculture, or agriculturalists versus folks who raise livestock and who migrate from place to place.
Cain needed property rights to put up his rows of crops. Wonder what he was growing.
To
Barley,
combine his labor with
wheat.
nature. Yep. Or barley or whatever crops he was growing.
Spelt.
And by the way, that quote from Rousseau's view of human nature may come from the Discourse on the Origin and Foundation of the Inequality of Mankind. Rousseau, I'm reading this out of a SlideShare that came from a PowerPoint that discussed Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, and there are 4 points on this. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Share screen. Come on, and let me see. I'll just share that window. There we go. And let's see if I can make this big. Okay, so Rousseau's view of human nature. Civilization brought inequality and other evils. People have a sense of freedom, a facility for self-improvement, a natural feeling of compassion and self-love. The key social bond has been the development of private property. The first man who, having enclosed a piece of ground, bethought himself of saying, "This is mine," and found people simple enough to believe him, was the real founder of civil society. That's not the complete quote. The complete quote is, he goes on, I think, maybe it could have been in a later work or it could be later on in this work. But the complete idea that I've read later says, do not believe this man. Instead, pull up his markers or fill in the ditch that established his claim, and tell all the other people that as soon as you start believing this, then because that establishes a privilege to be able to control the land. And I think that one could take a fuzzy kind of 10,000 foot view and say, the story of Cain and Abel, which Jordan Peterson in his talks keeps talking about, it's such a powerful story, because in just this tiny little story comes so much of the conditions that we're in and under, because it describes it from so many different ways. But one of the ways to describe it is this idea that when people start to have, and it wasn't always like this, there wasn't permanent capture and inheritance, there wasn't permanent enclosures. For a very long time, you had open land rights and common land, and people would have a right to farm on the common land, and when they weren't using it, others could come and plant those crops. The things such as enclosure and land laws that go back to the 1600s, and also the Magna Carta in the 1200s. And there was a sister document to the Magna Carta that was the rights to the trees in the forest, where people could go in and would have free right to gather fuel from the forests, like fallen branches, to heat their ovens, to cook their food, to make their tea, whatnot. So a lot of those rights were disappeared by those who are holding land, and then they like to treat it not that as though it were common, but as though it were only belonging to the insider group who held the land and had rights to the land, and who could write the rights of the land to this very few set, not even all their inheritance, just the eldest inheritant who would learn the secret of land, that those who control the land control the people. And this is how you maintain these human hierarchies. That is the difference between, like for me, within Christology itself, that is at least Western Christology, that is the primary difference that I'm contending with, is such as the hierarchy of the church from the Catholic Church versus the flatness of Protestantism, or like for instance, the Anabaptist who would say that it's just God, of course, within Christianity as revealed through Jesus Christ, versus versus entire hierarchy, and then you operate through priests, and you bow to the priest, and the priest bows to the bishop, and the bishop bows to the archbishop, and the archbishop goes to the cardinals, and the cardinals go to the person they've elected to fill the shoes of Peter, the rock that Christ built his church upon. But then there's an inverse way that you can view it, which is to say the layperson who's being served by the priest, who's being served by the bishop, who's being served by the archbishops, who's being served by the cardinals, who's being served by the vicar of Christ, which would be, I guess, an English way of saying the Pope or church within the Church of Rome. So if indeed the Catholic Church is operating not out of, or the members within it are not operating within their own selfish desires and making allowances for them in order to support and maintain the wealth of the church, by selling indulgences, for instance, which was one of the big theses that the Protestants bring up, which was part of the 95 theses, or theses that Martin Luther nailed to that church church door, which, by the way, is today metal. You'd have to weld it on, tack weld something on if you wanted to do something like that today, because people have tried. Folks kept on trying to symbolically nail more of them onto the wooden doors, so they replaced them with metal. But if
maybe he used Scotch tape.
Well, no, he nailed it after writing it. He nailed it onto the wooden door of that church that was so famous in history. But if that's only what 400 or 500 years ago. If the entire church, or if the people in the church are operating as Christ operated on the earth, which is to say, not to be served, but rather to serve, then the Catholic Church, or the Church of Rome, however you want to refer to it, is fulfilling God's will upon the earth. Because again, the beauty of Jesus is God coming down not as this mighty conqueror or destroyer or recreate, not as all these great and mighty almighty things, but is God humbling God's self down to our level as an infant, as a human being, as someone who lives and has been tempted in all the ways that we are tempted, and yet does not err, does not fall short from the grace of God. That's Jesus Christ, and that's his prayer was that his followers would be in him as he was in the Father, in God, and that so long as Jesus was obeying the will of the Father, and we obey the will of Jesus Christ, we become one in the Spirit, which is to say, the Spirit of God existing in God the Father, existing in God the Son, existing in those who are obeying his commands. So
So is there a way to have common property?
mm-hmm. That was Henry George's really radical statement in the, and I don't think it's that radical when you think about the enclosure laws that were put into place in England in the early 1600s. Around 1604, landlocking and the system of inheritance to the eldest heir, that was set into place 16 years before this first successful British colony. The people who were commonly known as the Puritans, who wanted to escape that system and go create a new, live according to their consciousness, is as they were receiving it through all the influences and that were bubbling up. Because and I am an advocate of the hedge between church and state, because I feel like the Danbury, Connecticut Baptists who wrote Thomas Jefferson calling for that were very they were most likely based upon their letter. They were studiers of history. They knew that the history of Europe was the state influencing and polluting the church. There's a wonderful talk by the Reverend, he's a Catholic, but a married Catholic with 13 children out of order. I think he was ordained in 1981 out of Damascus, Syria. And the order that he was in, they allowed those priests to marry. And he was the rector of a theological seminary out of Boston for a number of years. He's given a number of talks. And there's this wonderful talk by the man, his name is Emmanuel Charles McCarthy. And in his youth, before he became a priest, he was actually a Marine in the United States Marines. But he talks about Christian nonviolence and how the greatest error in history was the condoning of in the name of Jesus Christ violence. So he's very much a nonviolent sort of teacher. So I'll send you a link to that talk. The desire to know the truth, at least as Emmanuel Charles McCarthy has explored it, has spoken on it. Which goes back to the time of Constantine, of course, and how just war theory, just this pagan concept, doesn't work and doesn't belong within the domain of the church, because it's really a pagan concept. And that is again the argument of the Protestants. It's the argument of the Muslims that they're not practicing the true pure religion that James, the brother and servant of Jesus Christ, had mentioned in his letter that's published in the New Testament, chapter 1, verse 27, about looking after widows and orphans and not allowing yourself being polluted by the world is pure religion. Because the Muslims and the Protestants would say to the Catholic Church, well, these were mistakes that were made in the church that polluted the church and the people in the church, because it said that Jesus Christ condoned violence. When you read the Gospels, it's difficult. You can't really find. You can't find that the war was against flesh and blood. You can find in Ephesians, Paul's letter to the church of Ephesus, chapter 6, verse 12, after talking about donning the whole armor of God, which is a giant series of metaphors and analogies for what God's word and righteousness and all these faith and comparing them to a soldier's equipment. And then at the end of that, caps it off with, and I'm going to read it to you. I'll just read it from King James Bible, Ephesians 6, and go down to verse 12. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. That verse 11 to Ephesians, it says, put on the whole armor of God, and 1 through 10. Read the whole letter, but start at Ephesians 1:1. Ephesians 11:11 is put on the whole armor of God, that ye may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. Ephesians, this is the King James Version translation from 1611, but it starts with 6:1. Ephesians chapter 6, verse 1. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor thy father and thy mother, which is the first commandment, with promise, that it may be well with thee, and thou mayst live long on the earth. And ye fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. Servants, be obedient to them that are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, in singleness of your heart as unto Christ. So, I mean, even if your earthly master is not a good man, you're still called to treat as though you're serving Christ himself. So it does support hierarchy here, but it also, the whole letter to the church of Ephesus, who were getting it wrong when originally they were getting it so right, is about bringing order into the situation and showing by word and deed how it is that we are to live with each other in community and in communities and in relation to God, in relation with others, in relation with our parents, in relation to the people that we serve, in relation to people who serve us. It's so total. It's probably what my favorite letter in the whole New Testament is Ephesians. And so much the foundation of it is love. And this is about bringing out the best life. Not with eye service as men pleasers, verse 6 of Ephesians chapter 6, but as servants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, with good will doing service as to the Lord and not to men. Verse 8, knowing that whatsoever good deed any man doeth, the same shall he receive of the Lord, whether he be bond or free. And ye masters, do the same things unto them, forbearing, threatening, which I think is saying not threatening, knowing that your master also is in heaven. There is neither is there respect of persons with him, saying that do unto others. I think it's a reference to unto others as you want done unto yourself, because if you're not treating those who serve you justly, then God can give you the same treatment. And that in the kingdom of heaven there is no difference between bond or free, or no respect of persons. In other words, privilege is not something that's there in the kingdom. Finally, my brethren, be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might. And then it says, put on the whole armor of God that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. Further on, the various, you come up with the he gives the analogies of how that works. But again, the penultimate, at least for me here, that comes about again and again is, for we wrestle not against flesh and blood. In other words, you're not out to kill people or to draw blood. We're not even wrestling with people, but it's against principalities, which is to say those who are inheriting the land and who are thinking themselves the only true humans, and that everyone else are just in maybe human form and can treat those like beasts of burden, just animals that they can take advantage of. No, don't do that. That's a principality against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of the world, against spiritual witnesses, and I've got to go. So it's been a pleasure, Jairo, and I hope we get to do more of this again.
Go enjoy the beach. Get a tan.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Oh, that's not